Super. Welcome everyone to this first annual seminar of the Center for Binational Institutions that we're gonna launch today. Is the Coppel-Intuit Center for Binational Institutions, and I'll start with that. Giving some thanks to the Coppel group in Mexico and Intuit in US for being the sponsors for this center. And I'll take 3 minutes just to tell you a little bit about the center we're launching today and about the seminar we're gonna have today. We're gonna have 3 hours basically of 2 panels and other speakers to talk about specifically about institutions. We sometimes, or we always talk about, you know, migration and trade and climate change and energy and supply chains. But at the end, the institutions, both in Mexico and in the US, and the binational institutions that we created for many years are the ones who support all the work and all the accomplishments, goals, the accountability on this very complex relationship. So 2 years ago, in a convocation event, a gathering of 12 former ambassadors from the US-Mexico relationship, their most, I believe, impactful recommendation last year was to build and to reinforce a better relationship through institutional architecture. So this Center for Binational Institutions, it's an idea of these former ambassadors that we developed in the US-Mexico Foundation. We look for help with Coppel and Intuit to sponsor this huge endeavor. On one side, the research and the analysis of all the institutions we have right now, but also the promotion of better institutions and potentially new institutions that we need in the relationship. So with that, I hope this seminar will be valuable for you, for your daily work. And I hope you take notes. I hope you take some ideas. I hope you end up this seminar with a specific messages, and please share this these notes with us, and we would love to post it. And with that, I'll give the floor to Cristina Martinez, who is our leader for this project, Center for Binational Institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Enrique, for the introduction. We are very excited to be here today. As we've been mentioning and discussing throughout the US-Mexico Foundation and throughout our own social media channels, we believe that the ties or our point is that of the partner is the belief that our ties between Mexico and the United States are increasingly interdependent, complex, and relevant, and that institutions play a key role in maintaining a stable, positive, and dynamic relationship. Therefore, as Enrique just mentioned, the Center for Binational Institution, the Coppel-Intuit Center for Binational Institution, was created upon the need to strengthen and improve such existing dialogue and cooperation mechanisms. In order, and we might say, how do we understand institutions? So in order to study and analyze them and understand them better, we propose a conceptualization, a lens of 4 categories that allows us to think about institutions in the form of agreements, which include treaties, interinstitutional agreements, joint declarations or statements. And basically, these agreements establish the rules by which the relationship is governed. We also have organizations that have a binational scope. For example, the North American Development Bank that was created under NAFTA. We have mechanisms that facilitate dialogue between key actors from both countries, such as the recent relaunch of the high-level economic dialogue to promote competitiveness. And we also have programs that were developed with a bilateral and binational focus, like the initiative back in 2007, which through the years has evolved into a series of activities and cooperation events. What's important about this framework is that it takes into account the interactions that are taking place at all levels between government, academia, civil society, and private actors. So we believe it's not only like the development and the strengthening of institutions is not just a matter of government, it pertains to everyone. And thus we have a role in their development. With this framework in mind, we have an ambitious agenda for the center. We started operations back in March. And since then, we've been working in the development of a binational institutional repository, or BIR in short, which will serve as a digital repository of information on binational institutions. We'll have 2 pagers. We already have some examples on our website. We have interviews in infographics to analyze the documents within our framework. We are also in the process of producing policy-oriented reports to evaluate this institutional framework, but we will also be presenting an annual scorecard and report, and we'll be providing actionable policy recommendations to the strengthening of institutions. And very important, today marks the beginning of our flagship event, the annual seminar for binational institutions, and we'll be discussing this, throughout these 3 following hours. So we're really excited for having convened such as a diverse community of practice, key stakeholders around the binational relationship. And we expect you to actively participate in the Q&A sessions that we'll be having in both panels. So last, before starting with our non-resident fellow presentation and an overview of interinstitutional agreements throughout the last 20 years, I would like our senior fellow, Ambassador Geronimo Gutierrez, just to tell us a little bit about his role and about how we came up to develop this framework that guides our work. So, Ambassador Geronimo.
Thank you, Christy. Good morning to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here. I was recently in a conversation with an editorial page editor or director, and he explained to me that in this age of very rapid information and response, it's hard to get the important things right. And his recipe, he said, was really about doubling down on thoughtfulness. Well, the Center for Binational Institution is precisely about this. It is about going in depth to study binational institutions between Mexico and the United States in a way that we further the U.S.-Mexico Foundation's mission of strengthening ties between both countries, and also nurturing the dialogue and the debate about everything that goes on in the relationship. And that's the center's basically main mission. Institutions matter, I think. I can certainly say so by my own experience working in the US-Mexico relationship. They are not a panacea in any way. They do not guarantee that all will be good in the relationship. But I think they do provide stability, they provide perspective, they help us with follow-up, and hopefully, as Cristina was saying, they provide a path to either find solutions to our shared problems in a better way or actually take advantage of the opportunities. When the foundation started this initiative, I gladly accepted to be a fellow and try to help in the process of getting the center put together, precisely because of everything that we will be commenting today. Institutions matter again, and it's common to hear today by people that in whatever shape or form are involved in the relationship that we should strengthen institutions in the relationship. And I think that's true. But the first step to do that is really to go deep into what they mean, how they work, when have they failed, because some of them have failed, and hopefully extract lessons that will help both countries and will help the relationship overall. And the role of me, as my role as a senior advisor, is precisely try to come up with to support the center's mission based upon the experience that I've had the privilege of having over the years on the U.S.-Mexico relationship. So I think this is a big day for the center. It's a big day for anybody that cares or is interested in the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship. And I think we're going to have a great 2.5 hours this morning. Thank you, Cristina.
Thank you, Ambassador Geronimo. We are delighted to have you in the team. And yes, today is a really big day for us. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So that being said, we'll get started with our non-resident fellow research around the overview of interinstitutional agreements throughout the past 20 years. Just a brief introduction. Next slide, please. Dr. Guillermo Garcia Sanchez is an associate professor at Texas A&M University School of Law. His research and teaching focus on the international legal architecture that regulate global economic regimes, with an emphasis on investor-state dispute resolution, energy, and U.S.-Mexico relations. A central feature of his work is the study of the institutional capacities that shape how executive branches engage with international legal institutions. He is our non-resident fellow at the Coppel-Intuit Center for Binational Institutions. And Julia Musquiz, born and raised in Brownfield, Texas, has witnessed the potential of binational areas. She graduated with a concentration in border development from Georgetown University and is a current third-year student at Texas A&M School of Law. She serves as research assistant to Professor Guillermo Garcia Sanchez. And after graduation, she hopes to facilitate binational cooperation through policy-driven actions for community building and economic expansion of borders. So welcome, both of you, and please go ahead with the presentation.
Thank you, Cristina. Thank you, Enrique and Geronimo, for inviting us to present our work. I'm going to share some slides because I think there's only one way you can actually capture this, and it's through an actual presentation. Can you see the presentation?
Not yet.
Not yet.
There we go.
There.
Okay. So this is a research that was actually motivated for a couple of years now. Back in 2016, through the U.S.-Mexico Center, U.S.-Mexican Law Center of the University of Houston, we organized a symposium where we brought regulators from the U.S. and Mexico to talk about how to develop hydrocarbon resources in the Gulf of Mexico. And one of the interesting aspects that came out of that report was the extensive use of MOUs and letters of intent to coordinate regulatory policies on both sides of the border. So that was the first time that I heard about the importance of MOUs and letters of intent. On the Mexican side, they framed it as interinstitutional agreements, and I will talk about that in a bit. So that was the first time that I heard the importance of those documents. But I think one interesting historical moment where we all heard about the existence of these kind of agreements was when former President Donald Trump threatened to close the border with Mexico because Mexico wasn't doing enough about migration. And so Chancellor Ebrard flew over to Washington, and they had a meeting. And out of the meeting, they came in a joint press release on what they were going to be doing. But a couple of days later, President Trump came out and said, I have a secret deal with Mexico. And it's a very good deal. And actually, they're going to be doing more than what they said in the press release. And then a Washington Post reporter was able to snap a picture and then decode what the actual agreement said. And one of the interesting things, everybody now knows the end of the story, that it was signed by Alejandro Celorio from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mexico and a deputy secretary on the State Department side. And it involved the program that we all know, of immigrants that stay on the other side of the border and how it's going to be handled, and the deployment of the National Guard to the south border of Mexico. But what a lot of missed was the fact that this was actually an MOU, a letter of intent. Actually, it was an MOU signed between Mexico and the United States for such an important issue. As a legal scholar, I thought there's clearly a broader story to tell here. So I decided to file in the summer of 2019 a FOIA request, which is a Freedom of Information Act in Mexico, una solicitud de acceso a la información pública in Mexico. And we did that. We received in the 2019. And then I updated it with the help of Julia in January 2021, and we recently requested another one in September 2021. So unfortunately, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs hasn't sent us yet the latest update. So the data that I'm going to be showing you today runs from 2000 to December 2020. And so what do we ask for? So we asked all these interinstitutional agreements that have been signed by Mexican officials and authorities with U.S. authorities from the period 2000 to 2020. Under Mexican legislation, interinstitutional agreements are written agreements regulated by public international law, regardless of their domination and regardless of the fact that the agreement is a consequence of a pre-existing treaty. These are many agreements signed by Mexican authorities, regardless of whether they go to the Senate or not. But this is mainly government officials signing agreements with other officials. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we requested the FOIA request to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs because under the Mexican legislation, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has to keep a registry of these agreements. And they just have to look at whether they have the powers to sign this kind of agreements. If it falls within their powers, depending on the topic, and that's it, and they register. This is an important aspect. The ministry does not keep a copy of these agreements. The copy remains on the hands of every agency or government official. They only register the existence of the agreements. We ended up getting 1,817 MOUs and letters of intent. The other thing that I also requested was the key cooperation mechanisms. And this is a document that was actually ordered by Enrique Peña Nieto, the former president of Mexico, when the first time that President Trump threatened to close the border. He asked all Mexican agencies to come up with a list of the key cooperation mechanisms so they could show the United States that Mexico was cooperating in many areas, and that many of those areas weren't actually through treaties, but there were many interesting and important areas of cooperation. So that document, a couple of months later, Peña Nieto left office and it was never made public, but we were able to get that through the Freedom of Information request. And I'll show you what information that it threw us. Then what we did was to compare the US database. So we looked at executive agreements on the US side. Now, many of these executive agreements can either be signed directly by the president, the State Department, but also they can be ex-ante congressional executive agreements. So these are agreements where certain agencies that receive the powers through congressional statutes to engage in international cooperation, they sign these kind of agreements. There's a big issue about how it's registered in the United States that I'm happy to go into details, but there's a lot of interesting legal details about how incomplete and how under enforced it is and the powers of Congress to review them. Right now, there's a lot of discussion on the legal academia and in Congress on how to make it more transparent. But just to give you a contrast, the United States has reported 67 treaties agreement signs with Mexico for the same period. And out of 67, 49 were executive agreements, most of them MOUs and letters of intent. And we only received officially 4 treaties signed during that period. So you can see that the vast majority of the institutional and legal infrastructure of Mexico and the United States is run through MOUs and letters of intent. And Mexico has a better, at least, registry of these kind of agreements. So going to the numbers, this is actually the graph. So what we did with the help of Julia, and she's going to show you how the database that we created plays out, we're able to map down all the signed agreements from 2000 to 2020. So you can see that there has been a huge increase, in particular in the last, I would say, 9 years. There was a drop with the change of administration when President López Obrador came into power. There are many reasons why that could happen. There was a change of administration. It took a while for the administration to hold on the key priorities. But also, as we know, the pandemic hit, and that also could have been reflected a slow turn in agreements. Again, we know from the media that especially the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Canciller Ebrard, has been very active in signing a bunch of agreements in this particular year, in 2021. Those are not reflected here, and we're still waiting for them to be reflected. But it's definitely, there has been a big drop in agreements. So out of all the total institutional agreements, we can see that 267 of them involves only local authorities. Many of these are sister city agreements, municipalities with other municipalities in the US and on the Mexican side signing agreements to collaborate on cultural events. But also there are a number of them signed among states. So Sonora and Arizona are very active in the relationship, and they sign constantly agreements to cooperate in different areas, from law enforcement to border security to economic development. Now there are 1,252, that's 69% of them are mixed. And this is raises other interesting legal questions, because as we know, both on the Mexican side and the US side, there are issues of having states signing agreements with foreign powers. And so there are interesting questions there that arise, but many of these agreements can be either Mexican authorities signing agreements with state authorities, or consular authorities, consular offices of Mexico signing agreements with federal authorities on the United States. Those are also measured there. And then we have 310, that's 17% that involves just federal to federal authorities. And our research basically focuses on this last piece, on the 310 that are the federal to federal authorities. When we go to there, and we try to disaggregate that data, we see, for example, there's a big amount of cooperation between US federal agencies and Mexican consulates. So that's a lighter blue line there. And then we also have US state authorities signing with Mexican consulates, and we have US state universities with Mexican consulates. So the consulates are very active in their activities in the United States. As you can see, many of these agreements have to do with the famous Ventanilla Única de Salud. So these are programs to provide some health services to immigrants and Mexicans living in the United States, but it also involves cooperation with ICE or CBP for the humane repatriation of Mexican nationals. Now, when it comes to federal agencies, so the US federal agencies and Mexican federal agencies, as you can see, those are directly agencies of the federal government, but we have also a number of US state city authorities with Mexican federal agencies. So many of these involve, for example, cooperating with California authorities for picking up trash, or the air pollution or the quality of the air in the Tijuana, San Diego area. And we also have a number of state universities or federally funded think tanks on the US side that the Mexican government has signed agreements. And I know, Andrew Selee is here, is going to be with us today, but that's the kind of examples. So Mexican government actually helps to finance the Wilson Center, or helps to finance the Migration Institute. And those agreements are reflected there as well. So when it comes only to federal, there are 310. And as you can see, these ones, there's a huge drop in the change of administration again with incoming President López Obrador. We were roughly signing, 23 agreements both in the Calderón and the Peña Nieto administration, and then 2018 hits, and then those dropped dramatically to 7, 3, and only 1 in 2020. Many of these, 28% we found involve security. And here I want to be very careful. These are at least the ones that they reported as security. There are some that are considered classified, and so we don't have access to them, so we don't really know what they are about. But we know that Mexico has incorporated with the United States in terms of security agreements. Many of these also come from the Merida Initiative, so they devolve from already existing MOUs, but then agencies signed particular agreements directly with the United States agencies. Now, the key collaboration mechanisms, this is an important document that we obtained, because many people ask me, well, MOUs, letters of intent, they're not really treaties, so they're not really binding, there are no ways of enforcing them. But if you think about it, when President Peña Nieto asked for the key collaboration mechanisms as bargaining chips with President Trump, and the list that came out shows us that the vast majority of them, this from the Mexican perspective, 43% of them are institutional agreements. this is telling us a story. These matter. These kind of agreements are important because agencies on both sides of the government take them seriously and follow through, even though there's no way of enforcing them in courts or international tribunals. That doesn't really matter. And I think that's why the work being done by the center is so important, because it shows that these institutions are really what I call, the heart and soul of how Mexico and the United States deal with many, many challenges. Now, consistent with the goal of the center, we can see that there are also some joint programs. There are also binational groups, and there are binational commissions. So the binational commissions tend to be those that are created through a treaty regime. So there was a treaty signed, let's say the water and rivers treaty between Mexico and the United States, and then the water commission was created. So these are also included there. But there are also some binational groups like the high level economic dialogue that we know that it has been now revamped. In terms of the agencies that have actually signed these agreements, other interesting aspects that the data throws, there are some agencies that seem to be more active. So the Ministry of Agriculture, for example, has signed 69 different key mechanisms with the United States, has 69 different ways of collaborating, commissions, groups, and then they see constantly. The Ministry of Telecommunications as well is very active in this kind of engagement. And then we have others that are a little bit less active, like the Ministry of Labor or the Ministry of Tourism. And with this, I'm going to pass now the microphone to Julia, who's going to show us the actual database, how we created this database. And I just want to hint at something before Julia starts. This database, we want to make it public, but we want to make it public in a way that it's user-friendly, because as you will see, it has its own complications. So, Julia.
Hi, everyone. My name is Julia Musquiz. So as Professor mentioned, I served as research assistant, and I was really in charge of organizing this mass data set. So as we alluded to before, what we received was a list of 1,800 titles of the agreements. And so we really got to work analyzing what they encompassed. And so we did a two-part analysis, and we felt that Excel, for our purposes of our research, was the best way to organize this because of the formula functions and the filter functions, which I will show you how we use those in a second. But I do recognize that it's not the most user-friendly way to showcase this information, but stay tuned as we find a way to produce a web-based publication. So what we first did was input all of the agreement titles into this Excel sheet and determine the type of entity that played a role. So whether it was a federal agency, a state agency, a university, or a consulate. So what the cool thing about the filter is, and some of you might know how to use these filters, but if you click here and you're particularly interested in only looking at federal agencies with Mexican consulates, you can filter here and Excel will hide all of the other agreements and only show you what you're looking for. So in terms of the formula, once this is populated here in the type, it automatically syncs to our statistics page. This is something that we saw just a couple of minutes ago in a graph format, but it's interesting to see the play out of the totals, but also by year. So the second part of our analysis focused on federal level agreements. So we decided to make a second Excel sheet that allowed us to take a deeper dive into these federal to federal, roughly 300 agreements. So what we did here was categorize according to the topic that the agreement encompassed. So you see here that we have security, trade, something that we talked about just a couple of minutes ago. But we did notice that some of these topics were just too broad and required subcategories. And so we did the same here, identifying the subcategories that were related to these particular agreements. What we also did was identify the specific parties to these agreements. So the federal agencies that played a part in these agreements. And so this is broken down by USA, Mexico. There were some instances where other countries participated or other institutions participated. So these are in the other category. Again, this Excel sheet is particularly interesting just because there's so much on here. And the filters really allow you to play with it in so many different ways to have it show really specific data subsets. Again, everything that's populated here is reflected on a statistics page. We saw this also in a graph format, and that's how we included it in our article. And lastly, I will point us to the institutions page. So this is just a list of all of the parties to these agreements. So if you're particularly interested in one department in specific, you can come and take a look and see over the years in what years they were active and total agreements that they signed to. So there's so much information that can be still pulled from this database, and there's so many studies and research that can be conducted. We really see this as a starting point. What we really wanted to do was highlight all of the ways that the US and Mexico are very actively collaborating through these interinstitutional agreements at all levels of governance that sometimes flies below the radar and isn't really highlighted enough. And as we did mention, we are really working to make this a public database where individuals can play with the information, just as I have showed you really briefly right now, and understand the nature of these binational relations at the basis of interinstitutional agreements. Does anyone have, I think we have a couple of minutes for questions maybe.
I think, Julia, thank you. We have to continue with our first panel, but we really thank you. We really thank you both for the data-driven insights and the importance of the collection of the data and analysis. You've worked really hard through the past 3 years. We look forward to continue exploring how we will be sharing this information soon with the public. So as you said, it becomes a public good. And both students, academics, decision makers can play with this database and continue their research minds. But this point of departure is really important. Thank you, thank you, Julia.
Thank you.
So we will be continuing with our first panel, which is moderated by Ambassador Geronimo Gutierrez. And if any one of the participants in the panels ahead have a question or comment around Guillermo's and Julia's research, feel free to address them during the upcoming dialogue. So with that, without further ado, Geronimo, I'll leave you to moderate the first panel.
Thank you, Cristina. Good morning again to all of you. Some might have joined a little bit late. So again, I want to welcome you to this first annual seminar of the Center for Binational Institutions. As I said, I think it's a big day for us at the center. I have the privilege of moderating this first panel, which is really comprised by great speakers. I'm not going to take too much time in introductions, but I do want to highlight the caliber of the presenters that are joining us here this morning. Anybody that is from the Tec de Monterrey and that has also earned a PhD from Brown University and that works in the intersection of politics and security policy has got to be interesting. And this is, without doubt, Reberta Bell Martin is that person. And welcome and thank you for joining us, Rebecca. The US-Mexico border is clearly one of the most important, most intense, and interesting part of the bilateral relationship. And few people, I think, can give us better knowledge and understanding than Tony Payan. As all of you know, he's a professor at Rice University, where he's also the director of the Center for the United States and Mexico. Welcome, Tony, and thank you for joining us. Media is a very important, I would say, the rather understudied aspect of the US-Mexico relations. And Juan Carlos Barrón, a researcher at UNAM Center for North American Studies, CISAN, who also heads the mass media in North America, Mexico, in the US, and Canadian social imagery, fortunately join us today. Welcome, Juan Carlos. It's a pleasure to have you. And following up with media, few people, I think, have covered the US-Mexico relationship with such depth as Jose Díaz-Briseño. As many of you know, he's a Reforma's correspondent here in Washington, D.C., and also the creator of the new English language news product by Reforma called Mexico Today. Welcome, Jose, and thank you for having us. So I was just mentioning earlier that institutions matter. At least that's my thesis, and that they're important for the relationship. And these first panel is precisely about that. And we will center on that questions, and we expect to hear from our wonderful panelists their honest, objective, and interesting views on that specific matter. Without any other comment on myself, I would ask Rebecca to start trying to address precisely that question, perhaps for 5-7 minutes. And then we go with the rest of the presenters and open it up later for comments and questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Can you all hear me okay before I get started?
Yes,
okay, great. Thank you. Well, thank you for an amazing introduction, and thank you to the Institute, Enrique, Perret, Cristina Martinez for all the work that you're doing on this important topic, and for inviting me to come and share some thoughts about the importance of institutions for the US-Mexico relationship. So just a very short background on me. I'm a political scientist, so you will get a little bit of a political science lesson in institutions today. And as the ambassador mentioned, I also, my expertise is in public security in Mexico. So when we think about institutions in general, what a political scientist would tell you is that institutions are important because they build trust. They do that for a number of reasons. If we take the definition of institutions that Cristina has provided for us today, that is agreements, organizations, dialogues, I would add that we have lots of programs, like different security programs, for example, economic programs would be part of institutions. Those are all important for their own reasons. But when we think of them together, one of the key things that these institutions do for us is to provide a space for interaction and, of course, dialogue and repeated interactions between our US and our Mexican counterparts. And those different repeated interactions help us build a culture of trust between the two nations, and then, of course, between our individual counterparts. So a lot of this has to do with accountability that has already been raised for today. Some of that accountability comes from legal obligations. So some institutions come in the form of a legal obligation. But the type of trust that I'm more interested in talking about today has to do with more like social interactions and the quality of our relationship as neighbors in this hemisphere, as strategic neighbors. And so when I think of institutions, this is how I think of the importance of institutions for this relationship. It's really centered on trust. And this has been a great strength of US-Mexico relations for a long time. We have a very robust history of institutions, as we just saw with this excellent research presentation. But I will say, especially in terms of public security, in the past few years, there's been indications that maybe these institutions are faltering. And that for me is worrying because, again, I'm thinking about trust. And when these institutions start faltering, they're signaling that perhaps there is a breakdown in trust. And I will say it's something that Ambassador Gutierrez mentioned earlier that I thought is worth re-mentioning is this idea that our relationship is never going to be perfect. Having institutions or having a bilateral relationship never means that there's never going to be a disagreement. And this is why trust and maintaining that trust is so important, because with these institutions and the trust that they provide, the idea is that even when there are disagreements, even when we do have different interests that we're both pursuing in a given issue, that we can overcome those disagreements and find a path forward for everyone. So this is why sort of these signals that there might be a breakdown in trust, I think are particularly concerning in I can give you a clear example from the public security realm. There have been moves to reduce the types of actions and activities that US security-oriented agents can do in Mexico. And there's a very clear history in Mexico and many other Latin American countries of US intervention. So that's not necessarily, like, I understand where moves to do that would come from. But the period in time in which that is happening, it signals, it's a strong signal that there might be a breakdown in trust there. So one of the things that I think is particularly encouraging, again, with this issue of trust in mind, is the return of the high-level economic dialogue that was mentioned before. Now you might say, Rebecca, you're interested in public security. Why do you care about the high-level economic dialogue? Well, there's a number of reasons for that. One other reason that these institutions are so important is that we have, between US and Mexico, we have shared problems that require a multi-issue response. And public security, to take the example, is one of these. Public security is also an economics problem. We both benefit in terms of public security from the economic prosperity of both countries. Why? Because when there isn't economic prosperity in Mexico, or really anywhere, but I'll just use Mexico as the case, this facilitates greater involvement in things like crime. This creates greater incentive to migrate. These are both issues that the US is intensely interested in. And so it behooves us to be interested in issues of economics and social development along with public security. So these moves are really encouraging. If I think I'm correct in saying they were just announced, they're also going to be a high-level security dialogue. And these are all really encouraging because it signals this, again, we are building trust, we are moving forward with this relationship. And I think those are all reasons to have a very positive outlook on the state of institutions. And another reason that programs like what you guys are doing here and with this seminar are so important at this moment in time, because things are happening on this arena and they deserve dialogue. So very briefly, I want to leave just a few comments about the institutions and the US-Mexico relationship going forward, and I'll be very, very brief. So thinking of opportunities in the future, I was really struck by the research presentation about really how the diversity of agreements that we have and the diversity of actors in those agreements. Ambassador Gutierrez had a great op-ed in The Hill that I encourage you all to read. And I think he made a really great point there, which is that one of the things that has frustrated some aspects of the institutional relationship between US and Mexico in the past is the electoral cycle, because in the past, the US-Mexican institutions didn't allow for re-election. And the consequences of that are that our institutions that we're hoping to collaborate with, our counterparts that we're hoping to collaborate with, lack institutional memory because there's a high turnover within these institutions. And so looking forward, we now have open inroads for re-election. And so there might be some inroads there. But in the meantime, as it seems like we're opening up again these dialogues, one area for opportunity is to think about more bureaucratic level relationships, developing and establishing bureaucratic level institutions that aren't so dependent on the electoral cycle. And that would give us sort of lasting accountability, the ability to do follow-up. and to address these, shared issues in a way that withstands. And that is really the purpose of institutions, is to withstand fluctuations in the political context. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I would stay with two important concepts that you've touched upon. One is trust, the idea that all these institutions, regardless of what how efficient they are, to some extent at least, they reflect a level of trust in the relationship and among counterparts, and I think that's important. And one more point, which is stability. This idea that if things are constantly moving, and we have electoral cycles and people coming in and coming out, you can't really quite rely only on the people, although they are extremely important to keep the relationship on track. So those are great comments. And if you allow me to move forward, I would ask then Tony Payan for his comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Geronimo. First of all, let me thank you, Geronimo, and Enrique Perret for the invitation to share my thoughts with you. Some of the remarks that I will make at this point are based on this book that we just published recently. It's called Binational Commons, Institution Building and Governance on the U.S.-Mexico Border. It's a new book, and it's a collection of essays that deals with different aspects of the institutional scaffolding on the U.S.-Mexico border. I highly recommend it, and not because I co-edited it, but because I think it is right to this issue that we are dealing with today. The other thing that I want to make a reference to the prior presentation by Guillermo, whose work I know well, and I think it's very, very important, is that we often tend to focus on the formal arrangements, the agreements, the MOUs, the accords, and such. But I think a lot of the relationship between the two countries also happens along the lines of market relationships, networks, and such. And so when I talk about institutions, I think I also refer to even common practices and informal arrangements and exchanges that people get used to and carry out over time. So I think that the project could perhaps expand in the future towards those kinds of network and market arrangements that also add to stability and density to the binational relationship. That would be quite interesting. And the other comment that I would make on that is how to measure the effectiveness, because as an academic, and I can tell you that I often, because I work at the Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez as well, at Rice, we recently signed an agreement with the consulate in Houston, and very often those MOUs, letters of understanding and intention and such, get signed, and then nothing really happens. So how to measure the contributions of these agreements? The agreement is the beginning of it's an indicator of the relationship, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's content to it. Like, what is the activity that the agreement actually produces? What is the problem the agreement helps solve? So how do we take that leap from a formal arrangement or an agreement, an MOU, and on to actual activity? And some of them produce quite a bit of activity, like the North American Free Trade Agreement, now USMCA. It detonated an immense set of activities and unleashed market forces and created much activity. So I think another step would be to look at those arrangements in that way. Let me, however, go back to the issue of the border. I mean, the U.S.-Mexico border is a very poor place. If it were a state, the border counties, except San Diego, it would be poorer than Mississippi or Alabama. So, and the Mexican municipios, even though they may have a greater degree of wealth, hail from an incredible degree of urban poverty and really just poorly remunerated work in the maquiladora industry, high levels of unemployment, and a number of issues. And I think that part of the poverty that we experience on the US-Mexico border may have to do a lot with a lack of institutions. I think when there are no institutions, or there's an uneven development of institutions, or institutions develop at different speeds, they deprive the residents of a region from opportunities, at least in understanding of what is expected of them, what is expected of the economic activity, and what is expected of the government and the different agencies and citizens and such. There's a lot of confusion, and so people begin to behave in erratic patterns, in an unstable way of interacting, without channeling that energy and that enthusiasm that people may feel otherwise. There's no guidance because there are no institutions. And again, I speak of institutions not only as paper or even organizations, but also as expected behaviors, as practices, common practices and such. So there's a very broad definition that I'm using here. And I think we need to look at that. Now, what happens when there is a lack of institutions, as we demonstrate in this book, is that the different issues on the landscape are subject to political buccaneering and capture by political entrepreneurs. We saw, for example, how at the maximum heightened level, Donald Trump captured the imagination of a lot of conservative Americans regarding the border and proposed a solution to build a wall to deal with issues of immigration and organized crime and such along the U.S.-Mexico border. Well, that I think to me was a great example of political capture. Why? Because because we don't have the right institutions to deal with, for example, labor market integration. Some of it happens informally. I mean, those of us who live in or travel often to the border realize that many women, especially on the Mexican side, cross the border into the U.S. to clean houses, take care of children and elderly and such informally. They didn't really have a working permit. They simply had a B1, B2 visa card. That's a market, but that's a market that has been illegalized. It has been dealt with punitively, and it has been forbidden. It has been prohibited. And of course, it creates additional work for bureaucracies and criminalizes a number of individuals, when what really is called for is a type of visa that will allow for orderly and legal labor market integration along the U.S.-Mexico border. So that's a perfect example of the kind of chaos, lawlessness, and sneaking around the rules that is created by not acknowledging the reality on the ground and then instituting it. That is, creating the institutions to regulate it, and to normalize it. And I think that's one of the biggest problems that we have at the U.S.-Mexico border. And the other problem that I see there, and it's also a dearth of institutional development, is the fact that when we think about a certain issue or a certain geographical space, we have to think about it as a space of contention. There's always incumbent actors that have certain visions and how to deal with the issues. And at the U.S.-Mexico border, which is where I'm centering, what has happened is that we have not only allowed the kind of political capture or political buccaneering that goes on, but we have also allowed bureaucracies to be the ones that impose their vision of the border on borderlanders and the desires of borderlanders. And so we have a hyper-securitized region where the bureaucracies, especially US federal bureaucracies, control and govern the border for their purposes according to their vision, which is one of a closed border. And they have all the political support, and they've been able to position themselves in the space to be the incumbents, the holders of the governance units, the holders of the power and the way the space is governed. But that is not a democratic way of governing a space or the issue areas at the border. That is an imposition by a bureaucracy of a certain set of priorities that they have, i.e. security, at the expense of other potential visions. And then some people begin to move around to carve spaces of privilege. The large corporations that work with the maquila industry and of course other economic agents find ways of negotiating with them. The Century Lane, for example, is one way in which you carve privileges, but everybody else has to wait. And of course, the voiceless, the citizens, the regular borderlanders have no access to the border as a resource because they're not allowed to exploit the differentials from one side of the border to the other. There is no mechanism, there is no institution that will allow people to create wealth. The result is, of course, I go back to the original point, is that there is much prosperity left at the table because differentials from one side of the border to the other create opportunity to hedge those differentials to produce prosperity and wealth. And when you allow politicians and bureaucracies to do what they do, and you don't open the space to better governance through the right institutions, what you do is you leave a lot of wealth production and prosperity for both sides left at the table. There is an institutional deficiency. There are institutions that develop at different speeds depending on the issue or the subject. And of course, the last point that I want to make, oh, by the way, I do want to put this term on the table. There is a democratic deficit at the border. And I've written about that. That is, borderlanders are never consulted about how they want their space to be governed, the kinds of institutions and permits and activity that they want to see legalized and allowed so that they can live their lives. There is a kind of a democratic deficit. And the last thing that I want to mention that is also dealt with in this book, Binational Commons, our space, our common space, reconceiving the border as a commons, is the fact that there are also emerging areas that need to be looked at in terms of institution building. One of the chapters deals with infrastructure and the way that infrastructure building and maintenance is so fragmented and depends on a lot on centralized authority that doesn't allow the local governments in the states to really unleash the potential of additional infrastructure on the border. So institutions not only allow, sometimes they constrain as well, especially when they centralize power and don't devolve it to empower the locals to decide how they want to govern. And the final area, it's an emerging area, but I think it's become one of the most important and kind of flies under the radar, is the issue of energy. We map out the incredible energy infrastructure, especially with gas and gasoline and the kinds of exchanges that are going on the border. And they're happening by market forces and facilitated by the USMCA, previously NAFTA. And those are the kinds of things that can be unleashed, I think, when you create the right kinds of agreements. Now, obviously, my criticism of the López Obrador administration today is that they are actually disincentivizing and deactivating these agreements and not allowing companies to take advantage of these agreements, which they themselves signed onto, so that they can unleash their potential and their force for development. I think it's been a wasted opportunity by the López Obrador administration. Now, this doesn't mean that we have not, in many ways, been able to develop institutions. Often in the United States, Mexicans are accused of being unable to develop strong institutions. I would disagree. I think that there are three areas where Mexicans have proven to be very effective at institution building. The Bank of Mexico for Monetary Policy is one of them. The USMCA legislating a market economy, a market-driven economy from outside through NAFTA and then the USMCA is another way, with the caveats that I just mentioned. And of course, the electoral system, the scaffolding to run elections in Mexico that has been put in place and that has been actually attacked by the López Obrador administration are examples of successful institutions. The problem, of course, is security, as Rebecca mentioned. On that particular score, we've not yet built the right institutions, and the Mérida Initiative did not have the investment, the punch, and the coordination to actually produce autonomous institutions to deal with the rule of law in Mexico. At the end of the day, when institutions are absent, weak, unevenly developed, or poorly developed, I think what we are leaving on the table is really prosperity and well-being for all of us. And the border is a perfect example of how mismanagement and poor development of institutions really creates a region that is poorly governed, I guess, susceptible to political capture, bureaucratic imperialism, and mismanagement, general mismanagement to the detriment of all the residents of the border. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Tony, for those very interesting and thought-provoking comments. I think that you touch on two very important points. You actually play a little bit of the devil's advocate, saying institutions are about process. What about results? I think that's something that, you know, it's on people's mind and it's extremely relevant. It's the, you know, perennial debate about output versus outcome. And I think that's relevant for what we're discussing today. I think you also touch on a very important point, which is, you know, all politics is local. I've heard many times people from the border say that if DC and Mexico City just get out of the way, they'll fix everything in 10 minutes. That might be a bit exaggerated, but I think the important point is that the border is in itself a region that has certain properties that must be taken into account when institutions are built by the federal governments, and those are very valid points. Infrastructure, so it's a lot to chew on, and thank you for those very good comments. I would just remind everybody that we're beginning to get questions, so you can send them through the Zoom chat if you have questions later. And with that, I would welcome Juan Carlos Barrón's comments.
Thank you very much, Geronimo. It's a great honor to share this space, and thank you for the invitation for Suzanne and them. Also, I'm very happy to be here with Tony and Rebecca, and you, Geronimo. It's a pleasure to see your face after reading your several articles, and I'm sure we have a lot to talk after, and I'm very happy that I'm here. It's an honor, and thank you, Enrique and Cristina, for your kind invitation. I wish the best for this Center of Binational Institutions. Hope we can have a long walk with you. I would like to say that to start saying that it is very important to understand that the complexity between the countries within the United States and Mexico is growing, and we know that we have built some institutions to maintain certain functionality and certain beneficial relationships, and of course there is a lot of things to do, but we are going for this dialogue that has to be beyond governments, and I think that this is a very important way to keep it. I would like to share my screen. I don't know if I'm, yeah. Is it well?
Yes, we can see it now. Thanks.
So I'm here as part of the National University of Mexico, of the Center of Research in North America, and we belong to the Humanities Coordination. And so when we have this kind of questions, we always think about the forgotten issues that are the humanities, so how to go beyond commerce and security issues think cooperation. So, well, the short answer is we need to go beyond government agendas, and with universities we can strengthen collaboration, not only between institutions, not only between universities, but other organizations and people, even flesh and bone people, that we are trying to take into account how people are adapting to a new transnational reality. We are now understanding that that there are certain necessity for governance facilitators, because if we could have more of them, then maybe we can do better what we are trying to do. Certain times we are working with a lot of effort, with a lot of energy that is needed to keep certain dynamics coming. So, well, as I come from the university, I have to start with a little bit of theory, just a little bit, just to remember well the how this might work. Also, I'm going to use this opportunity to show how some of the things that we are doing at CSAN-UNAM and the potential that we see because of this transnational growing importance. So, well, when we talk about new institutionalism, we know that we have a lot of misunderstandings. But this is important to remember that that we have, on the one hand, a certain agency, every actor, in this case, universities, research centers, we have certain agency to get into a world that is already existing. On the other hand, we cannot forget that we are following certain historical processes, that we are inside of certain dynamics, of certain processes. And so we always are intending to create a menu of alternatives, how to develop our own interests and to identify others' interests, to try to connect and to try to do something together. So I work with critical social cybernetics, which I of course I'm not going to teach you about it, but I just want to let you know that we have certain difficulties. One of the difficulties is to really understand what our own institution, our own organization is trying to do. What is our real strategic decision we want to make? And when we go to a place for a dialogue and for an agreement, I don't know, with another university from the United States or from Canada, so we have to more or less understand what are the other goals or the other interests. And this can be very simple to say, but many things are, many disagreements start because we really don't know what is our own agenda and what is the real interest of our interlocutor. So cybernetics is about communications. It's about how a system is organized and how we interpret this system working. Of course, from Mexico, we have to always be very aware that there's a power relation there. We cannot forget that. It's if we try to think about this dialogue among total equals, we are starting from a lie. So we need to know that we have a certain power roles, which doesn't mean that it's always I don't know, a US power and a Mexican power. I'm not talking about this, I don't know, black and white stuff, but to understand what we are bringing on into the collaboration, what we are bringing on the cooperation, and what is valuable from this cooperation. So we create, as universities, small shared activities, and we are creating every week small agreements, international agreements, transnational agreements, and we are creating with this the common values that allows people from humanities to go beyond commerce and security issues and try to cooperate. So I bring a modest example. We are a very small center at the heart of the National University. We are promoting a network that we call REDAN. It's a network of researchers. But also we are creating some academic alliances with other universities, United States and Canada, and some consortiums to bring together money to try to strengthen the ties between our universities. This is bringing together people, transnational relations. We are bringing closer our knowledge, we share, we discuss, we know each other, we enhance our capacity to work together, and of course, we make friends, which is the most important thing in every relation. How to build friendship, how to build common values, how to build common interests, not on trust, not stereotypes. And this can only happen through formal communication, but a lot of informal communication. So REDAN is a group of researchers that work especially on the North America region. We work as an interdisciplinary group, and we work on regional issues. We have economists, we have philosophers, we have sociologists, we have communicologists, we have people that are working in environmental issues, political issues, refugees, immigration. And we are intending to discuss the new difficulties and challenges of methodology. We are trying to share our publications, to organize through a bulletin what we are doing, bringing us closer and knowing each other a little bit more. And by doing this, well, we try to encourage expanding knowledge about our region. We don't know too much about our region. We have a lot of research about our countries, but about the interactions, we are struggling, and it is difficult sometimes to make understand politicians the importance of this transnational knowledge, and how important it is to create collective interdisciplinary research that allow us to understand better, I don't know, how we work on about films, about literature, about press in Spanish, press in English read in Mexico. And well, we want to try to posit ourselves as a reference to make a node for information exchange and to link each other with our academic networks. We are doing this from the individual academic networks to the organizations, and then trying to help into another binational cooperation, such as, for example, the Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores of OBESI, the consortium with, I don't know, like the University of Arizona, with colloquia, such as the one we have with the University of Michigan, seminars that we have in in CISAN, that we have regular people coming to talk and explain what they are working, and I don't know, very different kinds of seminars. There is the institutional seminar of CISAN, the CIAN, but also there is a seminar of human security. There is a seminar on night studies, the seminar on education governance. And some of the researchers that are working in CISAN, my colleagues and friends, are trying to bring how to cooperate, from studying transborder institutions such as Roberto Cepeda, so working how higher education universities are working each other, academic migrations, climate change policies. And we have to do this because there is a growing transnational importance. We have more than 10% of the almost 600 million Spanish speakers of the world live in USA. Very soon, they will be the second largest country of Spanish speakers after Mexico. The Latin influencers are not only influencing Spanish speakers. Shakira has 60 million followers, Maluma 50 million, Ricky Martin almost 50 million. In Montreal, the census delivered that 15% of Canadians in Montreal speak Spanish at home. 500,000 Canadians are learning Spanish now. And 40% of Mexicans, according to the British Council, have some certain skills in English. Last week, our sister institutions on UNAM, the UNAM in Tucson, in San Antonio, in Los Angeles, have opened English and Spanish courses for refugees. So we are intending to be part of this. So what I have said in this short presentation is that institutions are key, not only because we are bringing together organizations, but mainly because we are creating interpersonal relations that are needed not only in a non-face-to-face communications like this, but also in flesh and bone personal ways to interact. We need to do this because we need to build not only the products that are important, of course, but we need to build friendship among nations. So what I did was to present a modest example of what we are doing here at CISAN UNAM, and I will be very happy to have any comments after this, and to open our collaboration links. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Geronimo.
On the contrary, Juan Carlos, we thank you, and very, very, very interesting comments on your part. I would highlight this idea not only about institutions, but networks, and how do they weigh in the relationship. I think extremely important, and extremely important to the center's scope of study. And I think you also bring a very valuable point, which is this quote, layer of small share activities and agreements to construct values. I think we get a lot of numbers of the big agreements, sort of the big stuff about the relationship, and that's what usually make the press. But what you're saying is, like in the case of universities and research networks that are just there, contacting each other permanently and creating to some extent shared values, working on the small activities. I think that is extremely important. Well, finally, for our last speaker, we have Jose Díaz-Briseño, who I'm sure will do a marvelous closing for this panel. Thank you, Jose.
Appreciate it, Geronimo. Thank you, Cristina. Thank you, Enrique. Thank you, Geronimo, for inviting me here. And the foundation has been a terrific partner for us at Mexico Today as we launch our operations just this past year. But anyway, I just want to make 2 points about institutions in the binational relationship. If the first one is about perception and the second one about communication. I was looking at the different agreements, mechanisms of collaboration that Professor Guillermo pointed out in his presentation, and you find wonderful stuff. Obviously, you find things like the minutes of the International Boundary and Water Commission, which are a marvelous treasure trove, of information about what's happening at the border with water commons. And they are going to become more and more relevant given the droughts and the climate change that's happening and affecting rivers at the border. Second, I was looking at things like, for example, Mexico and the US having collaborations, agreements on areas like reduced airfares. This is an agreement that was signed like 15 years ago. So it's interesting, all the areas of collaboration that we have, things that we don't even expect, right? And you would believe that having close to 2,000 interinstitutional agreements would tell, would say something about the relationship, right? It would say that the US and Mexico at least are attempting to collaborate with each other to solve common problems. I would love to see, if it were possible, I don't think it is, given the complexity, how many agreements does Canada has with the US in a comparative perspective. I don't think that any other country in the world would have that amount of interinstitutional agreements as Mexico has. It would be interesting. I don't know if it's possible, but that would tell you, that the perception would be that given that we're collaborating on every issue of the relationship, from natural species to radio frequencies at the border, you would believe that the populations on both sides of the border consider each other a valuable partner. But as you can see from all the polls in the US about Mexico, at least 1/3 of the population in the US don't consider Mexico an ally. This is striking. You can see this either in the Gallup poll, in the Pew Hispanic poll, or most recently in the YouGov, the Economist poll of people online. I think there's something to be said about perceptions and how institutions should take in account influencing public opinion and not just being reserved at living in a type of ivory tower situation where you don't interact with the public, because in the end, perceptions are key to move agendas forward. I would say that in the second point I would like to make is about communication itself. I've been a consumer of information from institutions for the past 20 years at least, if not more. I've been to the Arizona-Mexico Commission several times. I've been in the dialogues here covering it as press. I've been a Fulbrighter when I was studying my master's at Columbia University. So I more or less know what institutions and arrangements and understandings and mechanisms in the relationship provide. In general, I would say that institutions like, for example, NatBank, which is a terrific, fantastic institution, are very reluctant to communicate directly to the public. They have obviously obligations to the trustees, the members of the board of the bank, and sometimes they prefer not to, enrage or angry governments on both sides of the border just by pointing out their achievements. But I think that given the technological change that has happened, I think institutions on both sides of the border should start developing human type stories and heralding their achievements. I would love to have, to see either videos or small stories from NatBank about how life has changed for people in Ciudad Juarez who didn't have water sewage at one point, and how the investments by the bank changed their lives. I think that would, change perceptions, at least locally, of how institutions actually work. But that requires for principals at these institutions to engage and consider communication as a key factor when making decisions. Second, I would argue also that building databases is key. This is something that, at least on the Mexican side of the border, is not very well understood. Mostly, the Mexican government is very bad at keeping good databases. The interface of the Mexican government is terrible. It's not good for sharing information. That's something that the government should, address. But more importantly, given the changes in government, I think that institutions like the CBI that Cristina and Geronimo are leading needs to focus on this. Let me put you an example. The Merit Initiative. It's been 13 years since we have this strategic agreement between, or understanding between both countries. Currently, we don't know from the Mexican side what are the programs in the total number of programs specifically that the US has founded. There's no list of these programs. It would be great for CBI to create a database every year. Obviously, this requires a lot of FOIAs and access of information requests, but it'd be great. On the US side, the closest thing we have for the Merit Initiative is CRS, the institution at Congress. They provide the most accurate information that we have, but still it's very limited. But on the Mexican side, it's a total vacuum of databases to understand perhaps the most important institution that was created in the past 10 years or 13 years. I would just like to close with an idea that it'd be great to compare Mexico with Canada, just to see where we are exactly, how we compare in addressing, understanding institutions that relate to the US. I think that could bring more, interesting texture to our discussion.
Thank you, Jose, for those very interesting comments. You bring also a lot to the table. Let me just try to highlight some of the most salient points. I think you make a very valid and important one. And it's a cautionary note to all of us. We here at this seminar, everybody probably sort of on the wonkish crowd that really gets into the relationship. But you do caution about the fact that we need to not make this a insider's topic, and that it's very important, even with respect to institutions, to try to understand how people perceive the relationship as a whole, and also how they perceive, in fact, the institutions of the bilateral relationship, even if they know about it, which might not be the case. And I think that is extremely important for the center's mission and for everything that all this group does in their own, through their own institutions. And the other one, which is information. If we don't have enough information about the bilateral relationship, it's harder to measure, it's harder to understand. And I think that that's certainly you coming from the media, we should take that very, very, very seriously. So those are great comments. We've gotten a lot of questions, but I've been advised by the organizers that we unfortunately need to move forward with the next panel to try to keep things tight in terms of time. We will have probably a little bit of time at the end, but I just don't want to, thank again all these panel participants. I think that it's been an extremely enriching exercise, this panel, and we've got a good number of people at the audience that remains there And I think that the next panel, which is going to be moderated by Enrique Perret, and we'll look a little bit more at specific topics on the institutional architecture and how the institutions are currently, would be also extremely interesting. So please stay tuned, and I'll pass the microphone to Enrique. Thank you.
Gracias, Geronimo. Thank you, Geronimo. And I'll ask Tony, Jose, Díaz-Briseño, Rebecca, and Juan Carlos also, if you want to stay to hear for the next panel, you are more than welcome. And so listen, we are also trying to build an institution here, right? The Center for Binational Institutions it's by itself also an institution. So we're learning a lot from you guys, from you that are the real experts on the topic, on different topics. So I did learn a lot in the previous panel, and I want just to highlight some comments. You talk about institution building trust, social interaction, these personal interactions, and with that, I think we all sometimes remember, you know, the meetings of the presidents, the handshake of the presidents, the agreement signed in San Antonio of the first NAFTA, the cabinet meetings. And sometimes we ask, well, is that good enough? Is that valuable? And of course they are, right? A meeting of presidents, building trust, building, you know, this social interaction. You mentioned a lot the word accountability and results. You mentioned expected behaviors, transparency. Obviously, institutions or the lack of institutions can give us some corruption or not transparency. So many concepts, many topics, but I want to twist a little bit now with this second panel, and I welcome Kimberly Breier, Jorge Chabat, Andrew Selee, and Jorge Schiavon to this panel, and I will introduce very briefly each one of them. But I want to twist the question. This is the same question regarding institutions and how important are the institutions, but in particular for each topic, how important it's institution on migration, for example, or on security, or trade, or energy, or climate change. You also mentioned in the previous panel about bureaucracy, right? Sometimes you have a lot of institutions, a lot of agreements that you create bureaucracy, and bureaucracy can lead you to a lack of movement in some topics. So I will ask Kimberly, Jorge, Andrew, and Jorge Schiavon, in particular of your main topic. And I know, Kim, you know a lot on different topics. Andrew, you also, but you are focused on migration right now. Jorge Chabat and Jorge Schiavon also focus on security, but also migration and trade. So I'll ask you that question. You will have something between 5 and 7 minutes. Please, let's make this very interactive. And if I have some question in the middle of your intervention, I will do it. I'll ask with Kimberly Breier. Kimberly is now senior advisor on Covington. She worked previously on CSIS. She was she worked for the government in the previous administration, very, very well engaged, and she played a key role in the U.S.-Mexico, well, the new agreement, the USMCA, the TEMEC, as we called it in Mexico. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you so much, Enrique. It's great to see everyone, and I want to really applaud you for setting up the Center for Binational Institutions. It's really critical, and I really appreciate the work that you are all doing, and thank you so much for the invitation. So to cut to the chase on Enrique's question, I've seen the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship from a White House. I worked in the Bush 43 administration, from the State Department, most recently from the private sector, from the intelligence community on the security side. And I think I have like a couple of kind of lessons learned over the years in sort of the real world of, what works and what doesn't work. And my comments are really just about the executive branch, because that's where my experience has been. You may have heard me say it before, and I've written about it at CSIS. In my view, the US does not do a very good job of managing the relationship with Mexico as a general rule. This is not a partisan comment, but it's more one about structure. One of the challenges is that the US most often has a long list of global priorities. And very often when Mexico is on the list, it's not because of a forward-looking vision. It's because there's a problem or an urgency. And there are exceptions, and I actually do think Bush 43 was one of them. Where there was a vision. It helped tremendously to have a president of the United States who had been the governor of Texas. My view is that we need to change this, and we need to have a strategic vision and a plan for the bilateral relationship, and one that transcends the politics on both sides, so we can continue to work as governments change on both sides, as they will. Without a shared vision, the institutions and frameworks do not matter as much. Institutions are important, but they are not dispositive. Having the institutions does not mean necessarily that you accomplish things. The measure of the bilateral relationship is not the number of meetings or the number of trips. It's the results that can be communicated to people. I think success should be measured in results that make people's lives better and can be communicated that way. And I'll give you, one specific example to respond to Enrique's question, which is the Mérida Initiative. That was born in a moment of vision, in 2008. We're at a moment now when both sides, I think, are questioning it. We're at a moment where there are lots of questions. There may be a shared vision. The shared vision is that we need to do something, but it's not really clear, at least to me, that there is a path forward yet for what we should be doing differently on the security side of the relationship. I'm sure my fellow panelists will have some views. But in that case, in the case of Mérida, we have a framework that seems to lack a consensus on its purpose. And I'm of the view, I'm a staunch defender of Mérida. I think it is a critically important framework for cooperation. And one that makes a really important contribution in the bilateral relationship. It has evolved over time. It's quite different now than it was in 2008. But I think we need both governments to sit down, roll up their sleeves, and find out sort of what the way forward is. I'm heartened to see that there's going to be a high-level security meeting in Mexico City next week. And perhaps from there, we will see some of the vision for where we need to go in the security relationship. Turning back to the broader relationship and its mechanisms, it's a complex picture. We've heard all of that already today. I see sort of two main challenges, and this is sort of where the rubber hits the road day to day. And those challenges are, one, that the bilateral relationship often has so many priorities that it has no priorities. There are so many binational mechanisms, working groups, meetings that, mapping this out looks like the New York subway system. And I think we had a great summary of that this morning. One of my predecessors as assistant secretary once said something to the effect that every time you create a new binational mechanism, you must destroy two previous ones. And the point is, we're cluttered, and we need to better organize ourselves. So the first challenge overall is how you prioritize. The second is a newer challenge that I see, and I will call it the Twitter effect. Since the advent of both the 24-hour news cycle, which is magnified now by social media, the relationship often falls into patterns of being deeply reactive. That's what it feels like sometimes. And what this means is simple. We spend so much time putting out fires, some of them purely social media fires that have little connection to reality, that we lose the vision and the strategy of what we were trying to do in the first place. And I'll give you an example of that. I remember in 2018, there had been a terrible earthquake in Mexico. The US ambassador at the time had immediately offered US assistance, was on the ground. We had specialized search and rescue teams flying in, aid was provided. The US was all hands on deck and showed up in minutes to try to assist Mexico in this difficult moment. This should have been a good news story in the bilateral relationship, but it ended up not being so because the US administration was deeply criticized over its response to Mexico in this case. And it was criticized because it didn't tweet fast enough. There was an absence of a tweet expressing solidarity of support. It came later in the day, a few hours later, but so that was interpreted as a slight, and there was an entire news cycle about how the US didn't care about Mexico, when in fact, the embassy had been full steam ahead trying to be helpful. And people were on airplanes on their way, to try to assist. So it was a Twitter storm that didn't at all reflect the reality in the relationship at that moment. Certainly there were challenges at that moment, but that was not one of them. So to me, what's the best way to handle, this, given these challenges I just laid out, which are priority and also the tension between having a vision and the pressure and the urgency of social media. My view is that, as Enrique was saying, you do need a top-down mechanism to help you deal with the first problem, which is the priority and the priorities. We need to give Mexico the priority that it deserves. We've had many of these top-down mechanisms before. They tend to be North American. There's the Security and Prosperity Partnership under Bush 43, which I had the honor of managing for a while, so I have a very clear bias there. And then the North American Leaders Summit under Obama are two of the most recent of the North American mechanisms. I'm a believer in this concept. I think it is the best organizing principle under which to put the US-Mexico relationship. This is not to say that these bilateral mechanisms are not important. They are critically important, but I think the North American construct is a really important one, especially in the geopolitical world we live in now, where one of the primary issues we face is the competition with China. And even under these trilateral mechanisms, there were bilateral mechanisms. Many of the issues are what we call dual bilateral. So they're on different tracks with the US, Canada, US, Mexico. But I'll give you the bottom line on this. I think you need to give Mexico a different level of focus and attention overall. And in the framework of North America, that helps to elevate the issues and elevate to the level of having a long-term vision. And beneath that, you have the high-level economic dialogue, or you have the various bilateral constructs that we're starting to see from the Biden team. So if I think the SPP was so great, like, why didn't it last? And that's a really good question. One of the answers is, I think in retrospect, we did a really poor job of branding it. We did a poor job of communication. It was big on vision and small on communication. That's my sort of bottom line on the SPP. But I think there were lots of positive lessons from it that any government of any political stripe in the US should be thinking about. I'll just close by saying that, I'm actually of the mind that we're in a really interesting moment of opportunity right now, because we have three governments in North America who have a real focus on social issues, on challenges of inequality that are coming out of a pandemic in this moment of global competition with China. I think there's a tremendous opportunity on North America right now, and I would encourage all three, if they were to ask me, to be more ambitious in their agenda, not less. I think it's a moment that requires not just vision, but ambition. And I want to close by going back where I started, which is this concept of having a vision. We can have lots of institutions, but absent a shared vision, there will not be the results to communicate. And one of the things I think we can do on this, and I think the US-Mexico Foundation is doing a wonderful job, is bringing up the next generation of leaders, educating people about Mexico. We have to be relentless, especially on the US side. I'll speak only to the US side, but we have got to be relentless about cultivating the next generation of people who focus on Mexico, foreign policy experts who know Mexico, members of Congress, their staff across both parties, in a bipartisan way. I see no greater calling right now than making sure that as we get to the perfect framework of our institutions, which Enrique and the team will help guide us to, that we have the leaders to lead those institutions. And And I want to be very clear, please, count me in. I'm happy to do whatever I can to forward this, because I think we are really at a moment where the world is very, very complicated. The relationship is complicated. And I think we need that generation of leaders to come up who have the deep expertise on Mexico and can carry us forward. Thank you, Enrique.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you for the commercial on the U.S.-Mexico Foundation. We are working very hard on the U.S.-Mexico 360 program, bringing policymakers and future policymakers from Washington to Mexico and also from Mexico to Washington for a better understanding. So Kim, you mentioned vision, priority, common goals. You mentioned twice China, that I think it's a huge now issue, and it's an opportunity between Mexico and US and also Canada with some tools, with some institutions that we have already, like the USMCA, right? So let me go with Andrew Selee. Andrew has been the president for the MPI, the Migration Policy Institute, for already 2 years, right, Andrew? I mean, or 4 years. Wow.
Yeah.
But he was also president for the Instituto México at the Woodrow Wilson Center. He lived in Mexico for some years. I mean, he speaks Spanish better than I do. So, Andrew, please go ahead with your comment on migration, on security. I mean, whatever topic you want.
Enrique, thank you, and thanks for this great effort to focus attention on the disconnect between the intensity of the relationship and the institutions that actually exist. And it's great to be on this panel, to follow Kim, and to be with the two Jorges, Jorge Schiavon, who I see all the time, and Jorge Chabat, who it's great to see you again, Jorge. It's been a while, but a good friend of many years. It was great to see Jose Díaz-Briseño and Geronimo at the end of the last panel as well. The big disconnect here is, and I wrote an entire book about this, is how intense this relationship is, how much Mexico influences the US and vice versa. Although the book was primarily around Mexico influencing the US, it is basically a mutually intense relationship. It is the relationship that most affects us day to day in the United States, en carne propia, as you say in Spanish, and in our own flesh, in terms of our day-to-day life. Yes, you could say China is a bigger geopolitical actor. I mean, certainly what happens in the Middle East seems to, consistently disrupt politics around the world more than anything else. But in day-to-day life in the United States, there is no country that influences more than Mexico, and vice versa. I mean, I think it's fair to say in Mexico, no country has greater influence than the United States. I mean, we are stuck together whether we like it or not. It's an accident of geography, but it is also a result of human engineering. We have done things to engage with each other through history that has really built this relationship in important ways. That said, there's not a lack of institutions. As Kim pointed out, there are lots of institutions, but the institutions never quite keep up with the freshness and the intensity of the relationship, right? I mean, institutions have sort of a natural life cycle. It's hard to get rid of them once they start, and they're never quite a la altura. They're never quite at the level you need for the management of the relationship itself. And this is a relationship that goes, I was just writing down words here, I mean, there's sort of a basket that is, trade and investment and innovation and energy, all the economic side of this relationship, which we call trade, but it really isn't trade. Trade is a piece of it. It's innovation in each other's countries. It is innovation, collaboratives that go across borders. It is a whole set of things, of economic interactions that are deeply embedded in our economies on both sides, right? I mean, that are no longer, and look, a lot of people in both countries are deeply skeptical of NAFTA. I mean, there is certainly a scenario in which Donald Trump and Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who both have criticized NAFTA in the past, could have gotten together and torn the document up. And they actually came up with the skilled stewardship of people like Kim, came up with a document that didn't look that different, that actually updated some parts, maybe made some parts better, some parts worse. We can debate it. But in the end, say, because we realize how connected we are, that we can't, no matter what you think about whether NAFTA should exist, you can't take it apart anymore. You can't take apart these two economies that are so deeply interrelated. There's a whole basket, which I'll talk about in a second, around mobility and migration, which is deeply embedded. And we're seeing it's not just migration, it's also mobility back and forth, because we're seeing this during COVID and the limitations on mobility and how that affects us. But clearly migration, the largest migrant population in Mexico are Americans. The largest migrant population in the United States are Mexicans, right? I mean, there continues to be, even though the patterns have changed, there continues to be a deep relationship between the two countries. And then there are all sorts of shared challenges around third country nationals that come through the common space. A huge set of issues around public security. I'm sure Jorge Chabat will talk about that. And the fact that you can't really live safely in one country or the other without dealing with the other. And finally, the whole question of cultural interaction, social interaction, educational interactions that we should never underestimate. I mean, it really is how deeply Mexico penetrates in our, in our palates and our ways of thinking and what we read and what music we listen to. Mexico penetrates into the United States and the United States into Mexico in ways that are deep, and into our families, right? Into the deep connections that are personal, that are family ties and friendship ties. Now, I think there's a few forces going the opposite direction. I mean, there is a genuine skepticism around integration. I think it's tied to skepticism in the economic future of each of our countries, right? I mean, Americans look at the future of the United States and say, some things aren't going well. And one of the things we did was open up to the world. And by the way, there's this NAFTA thing. We opened up to Mexico. So that's kind of a, it's a bit of a proxy for our concerns about openness. I think there is some deep-seated nationalism in both countries that gets signaled every time things are not going well. And I think social media plays, the era of more diffuse communication probably plays a role in this as well. But it's natural at a time where inequalities have increased, and though the economies are moving forward in both countries, not at the rate that we might hope. And things like the wall, probably activated as well. Human error also gets in there. I think there's a generational question here we have to acknowledge. I think, younger Americans are much more familiar with Mexico. Younger Mexicans are much more familiar with the US in a way that is less complicated, right? I mean, Mexico is it's a symbol for older Americans. It's a distant country with which we have some sort of relationship. For younger Americans, it's just part of like the food and the music they consume, and it's part of daily life. And for younger Mexicans, and polling tells us this, it's the same thing. So there is a generational thing, and we have to assume that will change over time as different generations come into power. We still have older generations that dominate the political landscape in both countries. So migration is one of those issues that is most intense. Let me throw out 4 ideas here, that I think has most bedeviled the relationship. First of all, let me say the cooperation is not bad between the U.S. and Mexico. I was with someone from the U.S. government a couple nights ago who I don't know well necessarily, but we got to talking and actual in-person conversation, and said to me, I'm actually surprised. Someone who's new to the U.S.-Mexico relationship said, I'm surprised by how well we actually cooperate on migration, how much we seem to be aligned on things. And I think at some level that's true. That doesn't mean we're always aligned. It doesn't mean there aren't disagreements. But there is a surprising amount of ability to deal with complicated issues that at a different moment might have been very, very complicated to deal with. We're having a lot of trouble on the security side, but on migration, we're actually talking to each other. The second thing is, I think there is a lack, however, of figuring out what the common vision is, what this looks like in the long term, and neither the US government nor the Mexican government have figured that out. And what is a regional approach to migration look like, in which Mexico and the US play a part together and play a leadership role? And I think there's a lack of coming up with what that vision is. I'm sure Jorge Schiavon will say something about that as well. Something he and I work on a great deal together is how do you begin to develop that common sense of vision, which both Mexico and the United States play a part in figuring out how do you engage actors across civil society, international organizations, Central American countries, and Canada, Canada to Costa Rica, and probably Canada to Colombia in this case. How do you begin to engage that conversation around migration? And we don't have that because each country doesn't have that vision. There is the question that Kim mentioned about proliferation of actors. I mean, Mexican government, everything comes down to a few people. In the US government, it's a sprawling set of agencies, each which engage with Mexico on their own terms, or each's own terms, however you say that grammatically. So there is sort of lots of Americans in the government wanting to engage with Mexico, and sort of fewer entry points in Mexico. I think that's a momentary question, but it is also a longer term question. And I think I'm going to throw out 2 more things actually. One is, I think there is a challenge of getting back to North America. There are some things in which North America really helps us be our better selves, where we bring in the Canadians. And I'm surprised there has not been a North American summit. I think it would be very healthy to have a North American summit sooner rather than later. On migration, though, the Canadians are less affected by some of the migration flows today and some of the tough decisions. They are really helpful in thinking through some of the challenges They're great on refugee protection. They're great on development. You know, they have done a lot actually in Central America on legal pathways and labor and employment-based pathways for seasonal work. You know, it's good to bring them in as, you know, maybe not as deeply engaged with us, but as someone that can play a little bit of like almost our therapist, right? I mean, in some ways, you know, you can't say this at a summit, you know, the two partners are their therapist, but in some ways on the economic issues, we're all in it together. On the migration issues, the Canadians play that faithful sounding board that can help us think through what the broader vision is. And the final point on this is I think that's an opportunity to also bring in the Central Americans. I think there's a moment that we need a North American conversation, and then we need a North American and Central American conversation. And we've been working with a few groups on this, including the World Refugee Council in Canada and UCSD and Inter-American Dialogue and Colegio de Mexico, and others on a task force that's been looking at this, but creating some sort of architecture that allows North American countries to talk to Central American countries. And ideally over time, I mean, we've talked about a model of the Arctic Council, which I think may be pushing it in reality, but is a great notion to move towards, where governments get together, but they also invite some of the international organizations and civil society groups that are part of the solution to be at the table. And so there's at least an informational conversation going back and forth. That is hard to sustain over time, but it is something that is worth doing from time to time to try and generate that broad set of actors that need to be on the table and model that sort of dialogue that needs to happen. So overall, migration, you know, it's actually not a terrible story in the US-Mexico relationship. It is a story in which we've learned to talk to each other in ways we haven't, but we are still lacking the vision, and we are still lacking the way of once we have that vision, or at least a piece of it, which I think we can do better with the Canadians, how do we also sit down at the table with the other key actors in Central America and in civil society across the broader region and international institutions, and really push some of the difficult debates we're not having. So thank you, Enrique.
Thank you, Andrew. Listening to you, in this North American concept, I remember that the US-Mexico Foundation's first name was the North American Development Foundation, because we were inside the North American Development Bank. We were part of for a small period of time. So I don't know if we need to return to the previous name. I don't know if my board will allow me to change the name right now. But North America, it's very, very important. Living here in Washington, I mean, you always see Mexico as a part of, you know, in the universities. Mexico is always part of the Latin American studies, right? And that keep us away from the North America development challenge. So with that, and I think is going to be a great follow-up on what Andrew tell us, Dr. Jorge Schiavon from Selee. He's a research and professor at the International Studies Division, the El DEI and El CIDE, but he's also expert on migration. And so it's good to have you here, Jorge. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Enrique. And I want to sincerely thank CBI and the US-Mexico Foundation for their invitation. It's a true honor sharing this panel with such great friends and colleagues like Andrew, Jorge, and Kimberly. Let me start with my conclusion. And right now it's 12:27 plus 7, that's 12:34. I promise I will keep in time. Let me start with my conclusion. The best strategy to manage the complex US-Mexico relationship is recreating and strengthening bilateral institutions. Institutions, and more institutions. Why? Because they professionalize the management of the relationship, and they build trust, as it has already been said, but they also build certainty, stability, and predictability and accountability in the relationship. And this allows us to have a long-term shared vision, and also it helps us solve disputes before they become crises, as it has happened in the at least 30 last years of the bilateral relations, which I have studied deeply. And by the way, institutions and certainty and trust are good for both partners, but they're especially good for the weaker partner in the relationship, that is for Mexico. So the one who would benefit most from more institutionalization and strengthening existing institutions would be definitely Mexico. So I truly believe we're right now in a moment of opportunity, even if we're also facing some crisis in the bilateral relationship. Let me cite President Biden when he was vice president and he visited Mexico City in February 2016. He said, what do the US-Mexican relationship to look like in the next 5 to 20 years? I think it should be modern, competitive, integrated, educated, and the epicenter of global growth. We literally have that potential. And he has repeated this message now that he's become president so many times. And by the way, President Biden does not have a steep learning curve to manage the US-Mexican relationship because as vice president, he was responsible to some extent of it. And by the way, also both countries need and have to establish a good working relationship between them to generate stability, growth, and development. So where are we right now? Well, the bad news is that at least in the course of the last 5 years, there has been a fragmentation and weakening of bilateral mechanisms and institutions, and the responsibility lies on both sides. The Trump administration destroyed many of these mechanisms or made them irrelevant, and also through the austerity or austericide policies of the Mexican government, these mechanisms have also become less relevant and with less resources. And we are also facing, as you all know, a negative narrative of Mexico in the US, and also a negative narrative of the US in Mexico. However, and also we're facing challenges to hemispheric diplomacy due to the fact that we have fragmentation and polarization in the region, but also due to migration and the migration system between Meso and North America, as Andrew and I have worked jointly in the course of the last years. However, fortunately, and I know here that I'm preaching to the choir, the US is the most important country for Mexico, and Mexico is the most important country for the US. And in terms of trade, you all know this information. Mexico exports 80% of its exports to the US, and the US is Mexico's first trading partner. And by the way, Mexico is also the US's trading partner, not only for the country as a whole, but also for 42 of its 50 states. It is one of its 3 trading partners. So it's not only federal, it's also at the sub-state level. And in terms of investment, 50% of foreign direct investment in Mexico comes from the United States. And also we have 36 million people of Mexican origin living in the US, 1/3 first generation, 1/3 second generation, 1/3 third or more generations, from which on the first generation, unfortunately, around 50%, 5 million people are in an undocumented way. But also, we shouldn't forget that we have over 2 million Americans living in the US, and from those 500,000 are children who came with their parents and are binational children due to the deportations in the course of the Obama and the Trump administrations. So, and as we all know, all politics are local politics in the US, but in order to understand how the relationship works in terms of the bilateral institutions, we first have to ask ourselves, what is the condition of the national diplomatic infrastructure and capacities? Well, here, the good news is, and few people know this, but Mexico, the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs, invests approximately 50% of its budget and a fixed 50% of its personnel with its relations with North America. We have 80 embassies around the world. Well, we have 55 consulates in North America, 50 of them in the United States. And by the way, it's the largest consular network that a country has in another country. And this allows Mexico to conduct what's called multi-level diplomacy. I can share with you many of my writings on this issue. But the interesting thing here is that Mexico has the capacity through its consulates to work not only with the federal level and the different agencies of the US federal level, but also with the legislature, with Congress, and most important, with local authorities, local congresses, and relevant players at the local level in the United States. And this is, by the way, this is the secret of why Mexico has been able to contain US hegemony and also at the same time strengthen the bilateral relationship. And also, the secret is that the 50 Mexican consulates not only do documentation, protection, and attention of Mexican communities abroad, they serve like mini embassies in the 50 most important cities of the US, actually advancing the interest of Mexico through local politics. And remember, all politics are local politics in the US, in a system that is one of the most porous and also with checks and balances. So that has been the Mexican strategy, and it has been extremely successful. Now, what would I recommend? That we follow a dual strategy, which is complementary, by the way, in which we strengthen the institutionalization of the US-Mexico relationship by centralization and decentralization. Let me explain this to you. Decentralization, we should not only concentrate on the relations between the two federal governments, but we should actually include Congress, we should include state governments and local and municipal and city governments, also include more efficiently business organizations, civil society, and academia in these mechanisms, actually making this multi-level diplomacy. But at the other side, we should also build on the centralization for the coordination of all these mechanisms. And here, what we have is the revamping of the high-level economic dialogue. And by the way, I love it because for those who have studied the US-Mexico relationship for the last 20 years, this sounds a lot like the Binational Commission, and to some extent like the SPP, the Security and Prosperity Partnership, in the sense that we don't only want to work on economic issues, but we also want to include the prosperity and the security issues. So it's good news, and also it's good news that it will be coordinated on the US side by the Vice President Harris, and therefore it will give it a capacity to coordinate and centralize to some extent the coordination of all other mechanisms. So it's good news that we have this, but we should also revamp the Border Governors Conference and so many other mechanisms that we have. I see that I only have 1 minute left, so I have to go faster in terms of just saying multi-level diplomacy is the way we should work on the US-Mexico relationship by strengthening the institutional capacities. And my final recommendations are we should strengthen the national and binational diplomatic and personal relationships at the multiple levels of government. Second, both countries should deepen their existing public diplomacy programs to build a better narrative of the US in Mexico and of Mexico in the US. Both administrations should also identify areas of common interest while avoiding sensitive political issues to be seen in the public arena. And fourth, Mexico and the US should work together to build an integrated regional program for Central America and deepen North American integration, because both are central to the good management of the US-Mexico relationship. And finally, fifth, and with this I finish, Mexico should identify a strategy for navigating the growing rivalry between the US and China, and to see the tensions as an opportunity to become a better partner with the US and also benefit from foreign direct investment, which will be relocalized in North America. So I conclude with the same idea that I started. More institutions, and more institutions. The best strategy for a better management of the intermastic relation between Mexico and the US is strengthening the capacities at the national levels, but also of the bilateral relationship to actually manage this wonderful relationship of partners that we have constructed through decades and decades. Thank you so much.
Gracias, Dr. Schiavon. And more institutions, better institutions. Let me remind the audience to send questions if you have one. I think there are a couple of questions already for the panelists later on. Let me introduce also Jorge Chabat. He works for the Universidad de Guadalajara. He's a professor, researcher, a specialist on foreign policy and security issues. Welcome, Jorge. Thank you for your time. And you have 7, 8, 9 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think I will use 7, maybe 8, because, well, many things have been said right now. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the Center for Binational Institutions and the US-Mexico Foundation for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's always a pleasure to talk about these issues that sometimes it seems that they are not on the first place of the agenda of both governments. Well, the thing, I will focus on the U.S.-Mexico security collaboration during the past years. And the first things I would like to say is that compared to other issues in the bilateral relationship, security is the less institutionalized area for many reasons. Basically, well, I will say for two historical reasons. One is the traditional Mexican nationalism and distrust of the United States that have been, you know, the substance of the Mexican foreign policy in the past century. The other reason is that when we talk about security, people think on guns and armies and dead people and blood, and they don't like that. So that's has been part of the problem. And what we have had in the past years is a real collaboration between both governments, but a shameful collaboration. I mean, not very open collaboration day to day by institutions sharing information, but both governments were very reluctant to make that explicit and publicly. There were some attempts in the 1990s, especially after the Camarena crisis in 1985, and both governments created in 1996 the high-level contact group in order to prevent major crises in the relationship. But it still was a shameful collaboration. Even I remember at the beginning of the Fox administration, there were news about the attempts of Mexican government to establish an FBI academy in Mexican territory. That information came to the press and it was a big scandal. Oh, how our FBI academy will be in Mexican territory? You know, well, this situation changed in the mid of the past century, 2000, around 2000. Well, actually it began to change after September 11 attacks, you know, because the United States was very concerned about terrorism. And that's when both countries developed this smart border strategy, whatever it means. Sometimes it looked more like Maxwell's smart strategy, but well, anyway, it was some attempt to put technology there. And as a consequence of that, it has been mentioned, both governments agreed on the security and prosperity partnership, which was a good attempt to combine the need for security and the need to maintain trade and legal movements between both countries. But in the end, well, the SPP was just a declaration. I mean, it was not very institutionalized. It was not approved by the Congresses of both governments. It was just a statement and a document that obviously reflected these concerns of both countries, but it was not very, again, was not very institutionalized. But another element appeared in the mid-2000s that propelled both countries to reach the Merit Initiative, which was more institutionalized, a mechanism more institutionalized than the SPP and another attempts. And that was the violence in Mexico, the development of organized crime in Mexico, and combining this event with the concern of the United States for terrorists coming to the US through Mexico. That's why both countries decided to implement Merit Initiative that was unthinkable 10 years before that. Nobody will imagine that such an agreement can be reached because of the traditional distrust between both countries, not only from Mexico to the US, but from the US to Mexico. I mean, it was complicated to collaborate with Mexicans because, corruption here in Mexico is everywhere. And many politicians in the US don't like to collaborate with Mexico because they don't trust Mexican policemen, and I don't blame them. Obviously, they are not very trustworthy. Well, anyway, the truth is that the Mary Initiative was probably the most ambitious collaborative effort, more or less institutionalized, but there are not many other mechanisms. And as you know, Mary Initiative is, nobody knows what's happening with Mary Initiative. It's agonizing, it's fading. I don't know exactly if it's like the shungry cat that you don't know if it's alive or dead. That's more or less what happens with the Mary Initiative. Well, anyway, the point is here is that there are other attempts to institutionalize the collaboration in this issue. In 2010, both governments created the Bilateral Executive Committee for the Administration of the Border in 21st century. And they have had regular meetings, even the last meeting was last year. And in 2019, they created the High-Level Security Group, which supposedly was also aimed to prevent crisis in this area. And there are other mechanisms established before, like the Conference of Border Governors that started in 1980, and it appears they meet from time to time. Well, from my point of view, I agree that at least in the security area, most of these mechanisms are reactive. They are not very institutionalized. They are poorly institutionalized. There are more bilateral agreements with no staff, no permanent structure, and the main challenge, I would say that in general, in all the issues of the bilateral relationship, but in the security area is very clear, is how to survive the changes in the administrations in both countries. How to survive elections and the new administration comes. And it has happened, as has been mentioned, with Trump administration, that he decided to change some things from the past. López Obrador has more or less the same rhetorics. Everything from the past is terrible, corrupt. I don't like anything that comes from the neoliberal administrations like Calderon, Peña Nieto, all that stuff. So it's very difficult to maintain institutions through the years if you change the visions and the perspectives of the administrations every 6 years or every 4 or 8 years in the United States. That's part of the problem, continuity, and that's something that we have to deal with that. And that's why I think it's important to create more permanent institutions that transcend the changes in the political changes in the presidency of both governments. Also, it's very important that the security institutions in both countries think in other issues besides drug trafficking, terrorism, and organized crime. There are other issues that traditionally had not been part of the security agenda that are now part of the security agenda. I mean, migration, unfortunately, has become a security issue. Doesn't mean that migrants are criminals, not at all, I'm not saying that. But you have to manage this problem that is creating some security side effects. The same with pandemics, natural disasters, cybersecurity. I mean, you have to include other issues. Also, you have to include local governments. It's very important to have local governments there because sometimes they are the first respondents to security crisis, and many times the central administration are very slow. They don't react immediately. So you need to include local governments and state authorities, as well as civil society organizations. this is part of the challenges for the next years. Unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic about more institutionalization, especially in the security area, for the reasons I have mentioned, traditional distrust in both countries, the changes in political changes in the presidency of both countries, and the continuity of these institutions. But while we have to work on that, I think, well, those are the challenges for the following years. And well, I will stop here, and thanks for the invitation and having me here today with these splendid colleagues that we have in this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorge. Chabat. I'll go directly to the questions. We have 10 more minutes of this panel. We have 2 questions related with migration. I'll make the first, and it's regarding the last 2-3 years. We can call it a crisis or not, but the question is if this confrontation at the border right now could lead us to more or less institutionality. If the US government, the Mexican government, leading with this momentum, let's say, will lead us to less institutions or more institutions. I don't know, Andrew or Dr. Schiavon, if you want to start, let's try to make the answers, short answers to leave everyone to answer.
I mean, quick answer is that right now, there's a lot of conversation. It's civil conversation, it's coordinated conversation, but it's all ad hoc. And so the question becomes, is there the development, investment in institutions on both sides of the border to deal with a new, different flow that is going to be new and different? I mean, it'll no longer be called new, but the flows have changed. And so, INAMI needs to be different. The asylum agency, Comara in Mexico needs to be different. CBP in the United States needs to be different. The way we do asylum needs to be different in the United States. All these institutions in each country need to be different. And we need to support each other in strengthening those institutions and the way they communicate among each other, right? I mean, if we make a bet on that, then it could really build the institutionality both in each government and between them. But right now it's a fluid conversation, but it really is ad hoc.
Thank you, Andrew. And let me follow up on that. You mentioned, the need for better institutions to lead, to work on what we have now that probably is very different on what we had 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but also the civil society and the business sector is playing a role, not only in migration, but also in security and on trade. Do you have a comment on that? What's the role for civil society, business sector on the institutionalization of the relationship?
I mean, I think that's a civil society and the business sector keep going without the government sometimes, right? A huge discussion on migration, civil society, huge discussion in the private sector about economic issues, huge discussion in cultural sectors about film and art and literature, but they're sort of locked out right now from the government conversations. And I think one of the evolutions that would be fascinating to see is, yes, mostly governments have to talk to each other, right? Because a lot of what they do is operational, but there have to be occasionally those moments where they get together and they bring in some of those outside actors, which are not outside. They're actually the cornerstones of the relationship, right? I mean, so, where that confluence happens. I'm not saying every every migration coordination conversation should have every civil society group, every economic conversation should have the private sector, but those key check-in moments should have a piece. When there's a high-level economic dialogue, there should be a moment where the private sector and labor unions are at the table. When we're talking migration, at least once in a while, once a year, maybe a couple times a year, there should be these bigger opportunities to assess where we are. And I don't think we're taking advantage of that yet, but hopefully we'll get there. Hopefully that's the new evolution of the relationship.
Thank you, Andrew. Kim?
Yeah, just a quick answer to your question, Enrique. I think it's a great question. And, one of the things I think the Trump administration was on the right path with that could actually be taken further was the notion that it was going to use one of the US's best development tools, the Development Finance Corporation, to spur development and job creation, both in Central America and in Southern Mexico. And that is deeply dependent on the private sector. The DFC enables the private sector. It doesn't create projects on its own. And so it's very much a public-private partnership. And so it's very much dependent on the willingness of companies to invest in these regions and to use the DFC to help them hedge the risk of that investment and to make those investments more viable. But to me, I think there's a lot of work that can be done there. And both the US and Mexico should be thinking about how to leverage the resources available in the Development Finance Corporation for exactly this purpose.
That's a very good example, Kim. I think, I mean, we work with OPIC previously, now DFC, and I think there was a more clear vision, at least 2 years ago, on what their investment should be in Mexico and Central America. I hope in the coming months they have again a clear vision on what to do in Southern Mexico and Central America. But that's a very good example. Dr. Schiavon?
Let me give you the same answer for both questions, the one on migration and the one on inclusion of civil society and the private sector. In order to have good cooperation and coordination between the two national governments, that is in the bilateral relationship, you have to have good national institutions which actually coordinate national institutions and their relations with civil society and the business sector. Unfortunately, what we see, at least in the Mexican case, and to a large extent also in the US case, is that in terms of migration, the creation of this interministerial commission for migration, which is based in the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is not fulfilling its role in terms of coordinating the different agencies in Mexico, especially with the Secretaría de Gobernación, in terms of attending the migration phenomenon. And also, unfortunately, at least in the Mexican side, not that much on the US side, it has been very difficult to establish these mechanisms of communication, coordination, representation, and simply having a dialogue with civil society organizations and the private sector. So if it doesn't happen at the national level, at least in the Mexican case, it will be very difficult for it to happen at the binational level.
Thank you, Jorge. Guillermo Garcia, you have a comment? If you want to turn on your camera.
Hi. Yes, just very quickly, just to add on some of the points regarding the changes in bureaucracies and the importance of leaving some documents as an institutional memory behind. You know, one of the interesting things that came up when we were doing the research and we mapped down all the institutional agreements, especially at the federal level, you see that in the periods of transition, there's an enormous amount of signing of agreements. And I think there's one reason behind that, and it's probably the institutional memory that the older administrations want to leave behind and try to tie the hands of the incoming administration. The only period where you see a drop is with the Trump administration and the López Obrador administration. And that can be either because, you know, there was huge changes in the bureaucracies on both sides of the border. So people that were new to the relationship, they didn't know what to do, what was available to them. Or maybe they didn't want to put things down in writing just because of the fear of eventually leaving some track paper that could be traced back to what they were doing on certain issues. So, but you see a dramatic drop. I mean, it's impressive. I mean, the height, for example, when Calderon changed with Peña Nieto, we had a signing of 32 federal institutional agreements. But in the changes of Andrés Manuel López Obrador and Trump, we see only 3. And then in the last year, only 1. So it's dramatic, the amount of interactions you see, at least at the bureaucratic level, with the changes of administration.
Thank you, Guillermo. We have 3 more minutes, and I don't want to leave this panel and these experts to ask you one question about educational exchanges between Mexico and US that for us in the US-Mexico Foundation is so important. And I have 3 experts working on universities and it looks like there is no much Mexican students studying in US and not that much American students in Mexico. But we see a lot of MOUs between universities in Mexico and US. there are tons. I mean, Guillermo, if we map that, probably there are more agreements between universities in Mexico and US than the government. And we had the FOBESI, and we had specific goals to increment that amount. Just very quick, I don't know who wants to take it in 2 minutes, how to increase the number of students in both ways.
One thing I would say, Enrique, and this is just a plug for public service. It's important not only to have the education, but to have government institutions and universities and others focused on the importance of public service and promoting that as a career path for the next generation. And I hope that many of the programs that have all of this deep expertise on Mexico will also try to get at least a few of the students to go into public service. Thanks.
Thank you.
If I may jump in, since I'm in a US-based institution, I can tell you that what the foundation and the institutions interested in bringing more academic discussions and more students into US universities, what we need to have is fund more chairs of scholars focused on US-Mexico relations and US-Mexico issues. It is impressive the lack of professors and Latinx-based professors in general in universities that are focusing on these issues. Like, I'm lucky to be at Texas A&M, where they value the importance of this type of research. But I can tell you the top universities, Mexico is in the same line of priority as China, Europe, and getting someone to be engaged in those kind of conversations is very complicated. And what we need to do is raise funds, raise awareness, convince the provost of the universities to have specific chairs and programs that fund that type of research.
Perfecto, Guillermo. Just one last comment, Jorge, Chabat.
Well, I agree. I mean, in that area, don't trust too much on governments. I mean, look for funds and support in universities, in civil society, because governments, especially, well, I don't want to talk too much about my government, but they don't care too much about that. In particular, this administration in Mexico, he doesn't want to support anybody studying abroad, no way. So don't trust government, look for funds and support at civil NGOs, at civil society, and universities. That's in the hands of the universities. Universities cannot expect to receive money from the government to pay scholarship. They have to dedicate some funds to that. I mean, bring us to some American universities do that. They can bring students from Mexico. They offer them the scholarships and assistantships. Well, and the same for professors. Well, that's the only solution, because if you trust too much on government, you can wait forever. No, that's not the way. You need to find support somewhere else.
Well, thank you very much. It's 2 p.m. here in Washington, 1 p.m. in Mexico City. And with that, we're going to end this second panel. Thank you very much, Dr. Schiavon, Jorge Chabat, Kimberly, Breier, Andrew, Selee. Thank you for your time, your comments, your expertise. Guillermo, thank you very much also for your comments in this panel. With that, we still have 20 more minutes of the program. We're going to have some words from Roberto Velasco from North America unit in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then we're going to have some comments from our two main sponsors, Grupo Coppel and Intuit in the US. I see already Roberto Velasco connected. So Roberto, welcome. I think everybody knows you here, but Roberto, it's the General Director and Chief of Unit of the North American unit in the Cancillería Mexicana. He has been working a lot on institutions. I need to say, the relaunching of the high-level economic dialogue here in Washington 2 weeks ago. I know Roberto was key on that and working on different topics like security and migration and energy and many others. So Roberto, we had already two panels about why institutions matter in the US-Mexico relationship and how the Center for Binational Institutions is analyzing, studying these institutions. Thank you very much for your time, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Enrique, and my apologies. I would have loved to participate in the panels and to listen to everything that was said by some very smart and knowledgeable colleagues. I was actually participating in one of those institutions that we have, which is Comexus. We had a board meeting, but I want to thank the US-Mexico Foundation for this invitation, and especially you, Enrique. This is an initiative that we value very much. We believe it's important, and it's rewarding to see so many colleagues joining and getting together to discuss this topic. You all know that in the context of the increasing integration between our two countries, the increasing complexity of the bilateral relationship, it is even more important than ever to have institutions that, to a certain extent, rule the way in which the two countries engage with each other and with the broader region of North America. I usually say that if you had walked into a room 30 years ago and had said that Mexico was going to displace all European countries, all Asian countries, and even Canada as a trading partner for the United States, people probably would have said, well, what is this guy drinking? You know, what is he talking about? But that is where we are. Mexico and the United States are now increasingly important trading partners. It's a partnership not just about economy, but also about this enormous shared territory that we have, which is the border that expands over 1,800 miles or 3,000 kilometers. We also have an increasing and growing social interconnectedness because of all the migration between two countries. The biggest Mexican community abroad, as you all know, is in the United States, but also something that receives less attention, but is also very important. The largest community of United States citizens in the world outside their own country is in Mexico. So you have all these factors that are every day complicating the relationship, and the spaces that the two countries have and are able to build to talk about these different issues are, of course, important, help to guide the relationship, you know, beyond the day-to-day crisis and the day-to-day issues that we have to deal with, but allow us to build a strategic vision or strategic visions in different areas of the relationship. They also allow us to deal better with many of these crises. You know, for example, that last year we had this really complex crisis with the water in the border. It was particularly complex because it was an extremely dry year, and we had the closing of a period that the treaty, the water sharing treaty between the two countries mandates. So it created a very complex social crisis. But because we have these institutions like the International Boundaries and Waters Commission, because we have the NatBank, because we have all these different spaces, we were able to navigate this crisis and to come out of it, you know, in a way that was positive for the two countries. Where would we be, for example, in that topic if we didn't have this treaty, if we didn't have those institutions? And as Enrique said, we are trying to, you know, recover some of the institutions that we had in the past that we weren't using anymore, as was a high-level economic dialogue. But we're also creating new ones. Next week, on Friday, we will have the first edition of the high-level security dialogue that the two countries now will share, which is another one of these institutions. So certainly we share this drive, this concern with this group to keep building this kind of spaces, this kind of architecture that allow us to keep working together not just the ones that I mentioned, but there are many others, the Bilateral Commission, the Frontera Siglo XXI or 21st Century Border Group. I mentioned at the beginning Comexus. We also have NAPAPI, for example, which is another very important forum for dealing with pandemics that we want to strengthen within the high-level economic dialogue, and we want to build a new space to talk about supply chain disruptions. So certainly, I am sure that what happened in these previous panels and discussions are critical issues for the relationship, not only because all of these things bind our nations together formally, but because they help us to address specific issues, as I was mentioning. This Center for Binational Institutions will also be an institution which I'm sure will contribute to the bilateral relationship. And I congratulate all of you for taking time to think about this architecture of the bilateral relationship, to think about how we can strengthen it, how we can make it more resilient, and how we can make it, and this is something that I say very personally, how we also make it more realistic. We have a relationship that is full of so many different topics that, for example, I have a space with Canada called the Mexico-Canada Alliance that would be impossible to think about with the United States, because the scope of the different topics that we're dealing with, the complexity internally, domestically, of each of those topics is too big. It works very well between Mexico and Canada, which is a growing relationship that is strengthening, but it's still a developing relationship. With the US, it's a relationship that is way more mature and that contains all of these problems and all of these different projects. So think realistically of how we can create institutions that adapt to that reality of as I said, the many different things that happen, the complexity that they have domestically is super important. And I'm sure that this center, Enrique, will be a space to think about that, to think about how we can strengthen the institutions that we already have, how we can update some of them, and where we need new ones, as is the case, for example, that I was mentioning of security, which hopefully will be as successful as the high-level economic dialogue. So congratulations again, and thank you very much. And I look forward to keep engaging with this center in the future for these different topics.
Thank you very much, Roberto. And with that, Cristina.
Yes, thank you, Roberto, for joining us today, for your kind words towards both the U.S. Mexico Foundation and the newly created Center for Binational Institutions, and of course, for your important insights on the role of institutions. For us, it is a pleasure to collaborate with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as a key stakeholder and an actor and an ally in the ongoing work of promoting and strengthening mutual understanding. And well, as we said, in building a strategic vision to guide the relationship. So that being said, to close our seminar, we will have closing remarks from Coppel and Intuit, which are our sponsors across both sides of the border that are enabling our work. So we truly want to thank you, Gaston, Rodney, together with your team, for supporting the CBI's efforts, providing feedback, continuous feedback, and for being amazing partners throughout this journey. So we will start with your remarks, Gaston, but let me please briefly introduce you. Mr. Gaston Luquen is the Director of Institutional Relations of Coppel Group, which is comprised by Mexico's largest retail, in addition to banking, savings, and real estate services. He's also founder and board member of several companies in the industrial, financial, infrastructure, and real estate sectors, and has extensive experience in the academic, civic, and sectors. So the floor is yours, Mr. Gaston.
Mil gracias, Cristina. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And I'd like to share with you when we were approached by the U.S.-Mexico Foundation, Enrique Perret, with this initiative in order to create the CBI. we enthusiastically embraced it for many reasons, but chief amongst them are the following. That CBI will be a space and a vehicle. And by this, I mean a space where we can stop and take the time to reflect about our shared relationship, and a vehicle so that we may act in order to assist in creating better public policy that builds on our region's competitive advantages. Additionally, or in other words, move from talking about issues or problems, learn from mistakes, from missed opportunities, and also obviously from successes within an institutional framework to join with and catalyze other existing institutions to move forward better public policies. Additionally, we are also very enthused by the fostering of institutional framework building that is indispensable, but unfortunately insufficient in fostering any public policy. We aspire to democratic principles and institutions, and as such, the CBI, we think, is a proper place to exercise our civic duties. It's a natural space for civic development and to influence public policy. After all, we can't leave it all to the government, any government. Alas, these are some of the reasons we celebrate the launch of the CBI. We're also very enthused with the team and with Intuit, our co-sponsor and partner. We believe the CBI's greatest challenge will be the expectations we all have regarding the achievement of its goals. This through generating knowledge in order to be useful, a useful tool for governments, for academia, for the private sector, and for civil society on both sides of the border, while avoiding the ivory tower effect. The energy invested by all of us at CBI needs to create concrete results in order to justify its existence moving forward. In general, as a society, we're relatively good at analyzing and diagnosing problems, but we're not as good as at proposing and acting upon the solutions of said problems. We hope the CBI can be a catalyst for the proposals that lead to problem solving and maximizing shared opportunities. In ending, we look forward to working together on our shared objectives. Thank you very much for this time, and it's been great to be here, Enrique. Thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you, Gaston. This is Geronimo Gutierrez, and it's my distinct pleasure also to present Mr. Rodney McDonald, who is the head of public policy and corporate affairs for Intuit Canada, Mexico, and Brazil markets. Prior to joining Intuit, Rodney held senior roles in the government of Canada, serving in the offices of the Prime Minister and the Minister of Industry. He's also held public policy roles in the automotive industry and financial service sectors. But more importantly, Rodney has been a believer of the CBI and its mission and its crucial role in improving the relationship between Mexico and the United States. Thank you, Rodney, for your support, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Geronimo. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to thank certainly Geronimo and all the team at Center for Binational Institutions. We're so proud to be part of this initiative. And especially huge thank you for all of the speaker participants and all of the audience today for being part of this very important discussion. I think we would all agree this has been a phenomenal first seminar with really rich discussion from truly the experts on the relationship between the United States and Mexico. For those of you in the audience who aren't familiar with Intuit, we're actually the largest small business financial management platform in the world. We have over 6 million small business users. And at the risk of sounding kind of corporate, our global vision is to power prosperity around the world. And the reason I mention that is because this is really at the heart of our public policy initiatives. It's why we want to deepen our understanding of the relationship between the United States, our home market, and Mexico, which is our newest market. And the challenges that small businesses face in Mexico are very diverse and very different from many of the challenges faced by small businesses on the state side. But in order to power prosperity, we believe we do need to be part of this discussion. We do believe that greater collaboration and deeper border ties and facilitated border trade between Mexico and the United States, whether that's at the large industrial scale or the micro small business scale, ultimately will benefit Mexican small businesses. Their ability to prosper is going to depend on security and stability, and those things flow straight from good government and good governance. And it's actually a personal passion of mine, and I feel safe saying that in this kind of crowd, because I think you all share a deep appreciation of good public policy and the wealth and prosperity that can be unlocked from deeper collaboration between the two countries. And so our primary interest at Intuit is really, like I said, the prosperity of small businesses. A big part of that for us is finding ways to have more small businesses adopt digital tools. We know that small businesses who are in the formal sector, who adopt digital financial management, have a much greater success rate within the first 5 years of starting a business. But those are really side questions if small businesses are just facing daily questions of stability and security, as many are in Mexico. And so that's why this higher level dialogue is so important for me, to be able to bring back those lessons to our California headquarters, our business leaders, and also the leadership in Mexico to facilitate a greater, deeper understanding of the daily lives of small businesses in Mexico. So with that, I just want to thank everyone one more time and pass it back. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodney. Thank you very much for your comments. Gaston, thank you very much for your participation here. Cristina, do you want to end the session? It's 2:20 in DC, 1:20 in Mexico, and I think it's the right moment to close.
Yeah, perfect. Just a couple of final messages. Well, thank you, Gaston, Rodney. As we mentioned at the beginning of today's seminar, the building and strengthening of financial institutions is an endeavor that includes us all, which is why the active participation of the private sector is key to our work. And well, that being said, our seminar is coming to an end. I can't believe how fast the time went by. We want to thank both our lineup of speakers that joined us today, the audience for staying with us throughout the initial presentation, and the panels and these closing remarks. So we invite you to stay tuned to follow the Center for Binational Institutions on social media. You can find us on LinkedIn, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter under @USMex CBI. And we also encourage you to share any comments, thoughts using the hashtag institutions work. So in the upcoming months, we'll be publishing an annual institutional report and a scorecard.
I think we lost Cristina, but yeah. So we lost
the institutional angle.
Cristi, I think we're losing you, but with that, we're gonna close this. Please follow the CBI in social media. You can see the hashtag there, USMexCBI and USMexCBI.org. You're gonna find a lot of our research, a lot of our studies, and please, if you have any comment, don't stop and reach us in our emails. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you very much.